I'm Griffin Row. If you're drawn to the hidden architecture of history, the moments that feel like myth except they actually happened, make sure to like and subscribe, because tonight we're stepping into a very old story. This is the people who changed everything, without trying. Not the story of conquerors, not generals with battle maps or kings with crowns. We're talking about the trickster archetype, the fool who stumbles into fire, the ordinary figure standing at a threshold they didn't even know was there, and crossing it anyway. A world war that may have started because someone made a wrong turn, a kitchen appliance born from a melted chocolate bar, a financial revolution that began with $27, the internet, given away like a gift from Prometheus, and the structure of human life itself, revealed in a photograph that didn't even win the prize. Every civilization tells the same story in different clothes. The reluctant hero, the accidental prophet, the person who pulls the sword from the stone not because they were chosen, but because no one else was paying attention. These 5 people lived that story. None of them were rehearsing speeches. None of them were imagining statues. They were hungry, curious, frustrated, present, and history moved through them the way rivers move through stone, not asking permission, just finding the path of least resistance. Actually, no, that's not quite right. Rivers imply something gentle, something gradual. This was more like history moved through them the way lightning finds a conductor, fast, unplanned, and once it happened, you couldn't undo it. The deeper you look at history, the less it resembles a straight line, and the more it resembles mythology in real time, a series of thresholds disguised as ordinary moments. And that realization is both deeply unsettling and strangely sacred. Because if history can pivot on something small, then the boundary between the mundane and the monumental was never as solid as we pretended. Let's start here. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. There is a pattern in mythology that scholars call the fateful crossroads, the place where paths converge and destinies are sealed. In Greek tragedy, it's where Oedipus meets his father. In folklore, it's where the devil waits with a bargain. In Sarajevo, it was a street corner outside a cafe, which honestly feels about right. History has a flair for the anticlimactic. Gavrilo Princip was 19 years old. We often frame the beginning of World War I as inevitable, as if Europe had been sleepwalking toward catastrophe. But inevitability is a story we tell afterward, a way of making chaos feel like destiny. It's much tidier than the truth. That morning had already gone wrong. Several assassination attempts on Archduke Franz Ferdinand had failed, bombs thrown, plans unraveled, chaos. If you graded it as a conspiracy, it was a D- at best. Princip believed the moment had passed. So he stepped into a cafe, probably frustrated, probably ashamed. A young man sitting with the wreckage of a failed plan and, if the legends are to be believed, a sandwich. Meanwhile, the Archduke's driver made a wrong turn, then stalled the car, directly in front of the cafe. If you wrote this scene in a screenplay, the notes would come back. Too convenient, too neat, lose the sandwich, it's too on a nose. But history has never had a good editor. 2 gunshots, and a continent ignites. Over 16 million people would die in the war that followed. Empires would dissolve. Maps would be redrawn. The entire 20th century would unfold from this single hinge point, and the hinge was traffic. The Greeks had a word for this kind of moment, kairos. Not ordinary time, not chronos, the clock ticking forward, kairos, the appointed moment, the instant when everything converges and the world cracks open. If the driver hadn't hesitated, if the car hadn't stalled, if Princip had lingered a few minutes longer over his coffee. We like to imagine history as this massive grinding machine, gears and momentum and inevitability. But sometimes it's balanced on something as fragile as a wrong turn. And that doesn't make history smaller, it makes it mythic. Because mythology has always known what textbooks sometimes forget, that the world changes not through grand machinery, but through moments of terrifying precision. A steering wheel turned too late, a young man looking up from his table. The crossroads don't announce themselves. They never do. Honestly, that's probably the worst part. Or no, maybe the worst part is that we keep expecting them to. We keep waiting for the moment to feel important while it's happening, and it almost never does. From a cafe in Sarajevo to a laboratory in Massachusetts, 1945. Every culture has an origin myth for fire. Prometheus steals it from the gods. Coyote carries it in his tail. Maui pulls it from the earth. The origin myth for the microwave oven is considerably less dramatic. It involves a chocolate bar and a man who apparently kept snacks in his lab coat, which, let's be honest, is exactly the kind of person who ends up changing the world. Engineer Percy Spencer was working on radar technology during World War II. Magnetrons, radio waves, military urgency. He was focused on improving detection systems, work designed to find threats in the dark. At some point during testing, he noticed something unusual. The chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. Now, most of us would have blamed faulty wrapping, said something unrepeatable, and moved on with our lives. Spencer paused. He got curious. He placed popcorn kernels near the radar equipment. They popped. He tried an egg. It exploded. Which, depending on your perspective, is either a scientific breakthrough or a very messy argument for eating lunch away from classified military equipment. But Spencer recognized the threshold for what it was. He began experimenting deliberately. In 1945, he patented the first microwave oven. It weighed 750 pounds and stood nearly 6 feet tall, less countertop appliance, more monolith. You didn't put it in your kitchen. You built your kitchen around it. Today, over 90% of American households own a microwave. A machine built to hunt enemies in wartime became the thing that reheats your pizza at 2 in the morning. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward convenience. There is something quietly mythic about a technology of war becoming a technology of comfort. Swords into plowshares, radar into dinner. But what I keep returning to is the moment of noticing. Because discovery doesn't always begin with ambition. It begins with attention, with the willingness to take the anomaly seriously instead of brushing it aside. And I want to say, that's rare. That Spencer was exceptional. But actually, I think what's rare isn't the noticing. I think most people notice. What's rare is not talking yourself out of it. Not saying, that's nothing, that's a coincidence, that's not my department. Every day, small strange things happen around us. Glitches, coincidence, things that don't quite fit. And most of us look past them because they don't match the story we're already telling ourselves. Spencer didn't look past it. And that might be the quietest, most radical act in the history of invention. Simply refusing to ignore what's right in front of you, even if what's right in front of you is a ruined chocolate bar. $27. That's all it took. Bangladesh, 1976. In the old myths, there is a figure who descends, who leaves the palace or the mountaintop and walks into the suffering below. The Buddha leaving the palace walls. Inanna descending into the underworld. Muhammad Yunus left his classroom, which is, in fairness, a less cinematic version of the same journey. But the threshold was just as real. Maybe, and I'm thinking about this as I say it, maybe more real. Because nobody writes poems about leaving a university building. There's no dramatic score. There's just a hallway and a parking lot and a world that doesn't match your syllabus. He was teaching economic theory at a university. Elegant models, clean equations, the kind of knowledge that lives beautifully on a chalkboard and somewhat less beautifully in the actual world. Outside his classroom, poverty suffocated nearby villages. He encountered women trapped in debt cycles over tiny loans, amounts so small they would barely register in the world his textbooks described. The gap between theory and reality wasn't a crack, it was a canyon. So Yunus lent $27 of his own money to 42 women. $27, that's less than most of us spend on a meal we'll forget by Thursday. No grand reform plan, no institutional backing, no 5-year strategy. Just irritation, empathy, the refusal to walk past a visible wound. The women repaid him. Every dollar. That experiment became the foundation of Grameen Bank. Microfinance would spread globally. Yunus would eventually win the Nobel Peace Prize. But at the time, it was just a man who stepped outside a building and decided the gap between theory and reality was no longer acceptable. What strikes me here is the mythology of scale. We tell ourselves that changing the world requires enormous power, that you need armies, or algorithms, or billions of dollars. And sometimes you do, but this began with loose change. The financial equivalent of what's in your pocket right now, assuming you, unlike Percy Spencer, are not also carrying chocolate near military radar equipment. Every great myth has a moment where the hero's weapon turns out to be absurdly small. David's stone, Jack's handful of beans, a mustard seed. History doesn't always begin with thunder. Sometimes it begins with someone saying, "This isn't acceptable," and doing something small about it. I was going to call that brave, but actually, I don't think it was bravery. I think it was impatience. He just couldn't stand the contradiction anymore. And that might be more powerful than courage, honestly. Courage requires you to overcome fear. Impatience just requires you to have had enough. And that might be the most ancient and radical act there is. Not building an empire, just refusing to look away. This next one might be the strangest of all. 1989. CERN. If you wanted to write the creation myth of our age, the story future civilizations will tell about how this era began, you might start here. Though you'd probably have to explain what a physicist was doing that changed everything, which is a fun conversation to have at parties. Trust me, Tim Berners-Lee was frustrated. Researchers couldn't easily share information across different computer systems. Knowledge was trapped in silos, locked behind incompatible formats. The most advanced scientific minds on Earth were essentially passing notes like middle schoolers, except less efficiently. So he built a solution, a system of linked documents, hypertext, URLs, HTTP, the architecture of the World Wide Web. And then, in 1991, he released it freely. No patent, no licensing fees, no stake claimed. He could have monetized it. He could have controlled access. He could have become, and this is not an exaggeration, the wealthiest person who has ever lived by a factor that would make current tech billionaires look like hobbyists. He chose not to. The modern digital economy, trillions of dollars in value, the infrastructure of nearly every human interaction on Earth rests on that single act of release. There's something almost Promethean about this. To hold fire in your hands and give it to everyone. But unlike Prometheus, Berners-Lee wasn't punished by the gods. He was mostly just overlooked. The world built empires on his gift, and most people couldn't tell you his name. They can, however, tell you the names of the people who figured out how to sell ads on it. Make of that what you will. In a civilization organized around ownership, his restraint feels like something from an older story. The sage who gives the secret away, the teacher who refuses payment, the figure who understands that some things become less powerful the moment you try to possess them. Although, wait, I want to revise that. Because calling it restraint implies he was holding something back, resisting a temptation. And I don't think that's what happened. I think for Berners-Lee, giving it away wasn't the hard choice. It was the obvious one. The idea of locking it down probably never felt like a real option. Which is almost stranger, isn't it? In a world where everyone monetizes everything, the radical act wasn't generosity. It was just not thinking like everyone else. We live inside that decision every day. Every search, every message, every late-night scroll through content you'll regret in the morning. All of it flowing through a structure one person built and then opened like a door. History isn't only shaped by conquest. Sometimes it's shaped by the decision to let go. And that may be more powerful than ambition ever was. One photograph, 1952, London. In nearly every mythology, there is a moment of unveiling. The curtain pulled back, the veil lifted, the instant when the hidden structure of reality is made visible. Rosalind Franklin created that moment with an X-ray and extraordinary patience. She was studying DNA using X-ray diffraction. Meticulous, precise, painstaking work. The kind of science that doesn't make for dramatic montages but changes everything. No one writes a training sequence for years of careful calibration, but maybe they should. One image, known as Photo 51, revealed the helical structure of DNA, the double spiral, the architecture of inheritance, the blueprint written into every living thing. Her research was shown to James Watson and Francis Crick without her direct consent. They used the data to construct their famous model. In 1962, Watson, Crick, and Maurice Wilkins received the Nobel Prize. Franklin had died 4 years earlier, at 37. She did not receive it. She wasn't chasing recognition. She was pursuing clarity, trying to see what was actually there, beneath the noise and the blur, with the patience of someone who trusted that truth would hold still long enough to be photographed. This story lingers with me the way certain myths do, the ones about stolen fire, about gifts taken and credit misplaced. History has a troubling habit of rewarding the people who present the work over the people who do it. That's not a modern problem. That's an ancient one. I started to say that's tragic. And it is. But I think tragic is too comfortable a word, actually. Tragedy implies a certain nobility, a certain completeness. This wasn't complete. This was just wrong. And I think it's important to call it that plainly, without dressing it up in the language of myth. But here is what remains. One photograph, one careful mind, and now we can read the language written inside our own cells. Medicine, forensics, ancestry, biotechnology, the ability to understand at the molecular level what we are. That's not loud, it's not theatrical, but it's permanent. And permanence, in the end, doesn't care who got the award. Every civilization tells the story of the accidental hero, the fool who finds the treasure, the wanderer who stumbles into the sacred grove. We keep telling it because it keeps happening. None of these 5 people woke up intending to alter humanity's trajectory. They were hungry, curious, frustrated, observant, and history moved through them anyway. The way light moves through glass, bending as it passes, emerging as something new on the other side. We like to believe the world is shaped by master plans, by visionaries with blueprints and generals with maps. But the deeper you look, the more it resembles mythology. Wrong turns, melted chocolate, loose change, open doors, unassuming photographs. Not exactly the stuff of epic poetry. And yet, that's exactly what it is. Actually, I want to sit with that for a second, because I think that's the whole point of this episode. We keep separating the ordinary from the mythic as though they're different categories. As though there's a line between regular life and the moments that matter. But there isn't. There never was. The threshold between ordinary life and history was never where we thought it was. It was always right here. Always quieter than we expected. Always more human than the monuments suggest. Which means the next turning point may not look dramatic. It might look inconvenient. It might look accidental. It might look like something small enough to ignore. And that, strangely, beautifully, might be the most hopeful part of all. Because mythology has always known what we keep forgetting. The world doesn't change when the powerful act. It changes when the attentive do. So pay attention. You never know what's melting in your pocket.
Brought to you by Inception Point AI. Subscribe, like, and comment for more.